The first sound was not a trumpet, it was splintering iron. The second was rumor moving faster than hoofbeats. The Mongols were in the Punjab, and the earth itself seemed to tilt toward them. 50,000 riders spread like a living bruise across the plains, Qutlugh Khwaja at the point, scouts flickering ahead, smoke unfurling behind. Villages vanished into their saddlebags, orchards became firewood, roads turned into arteries for a storm that did not sleep. This was the machine that had unstitched kingdoms from China to the Caucasus. Speed as doctrine, hunger as logistics, terror as policy. You did not parley with such a thing. You survived it, or you disappeared. In Delhi, Alauddin Khilji read the dust more carefully than the dispatches. A straight fight on open ground would feed the legend, not stop it. Armories could make swords, workshops could cast arrowheads, but none of that touched the Mongol advantage. They carried no wagons, they lived off what they could seize, and their horses were as relentless as their reputations. If the Delhi Sultanate tried to outrun them, it would bleed out. If it tried to outshoot them, it would be unhorsed and encircled. The answer had to be colder. So the secret weapon was not a weapon. It was a system. Before Khwaja's foremost banners crossed the Sutlej, agents had already moved. Grain lifted from granaries and buried beyond reach. Wells capped and marked only on government tablets. Herds driven inland. Markets audited into stillness. Prices froze like winter water. Caravan masters were counted. Soldiers registered. Payrolls cleaned of ghosts. What looked to onlookers like tyranny was in fact a siege laid against the invaders' appetite. The frontier did not bristle with walls. It thinned into absence. Out on the plains, Mongol scouts rode through silence that felt wrong. No chickens scattering from courtyards, no gleaners in the fields, no fodder stacked under eaves. The first horses went light on the flank, ribs pressing against hide. The first men began to boil leather thongs just to chew something hot. Speed, so long their blade, found nothing to cut. Qutlugh Khwaja was not naive. He had burned through plenty of empty country before. He widened the screen, probed for softness, waited for the enemy to panic and offer itself. But the field reports kept coming back, uncanny. Minor skirmishers that struck and faded. Roads watched but not held. A city that refused to run toward its gates. Somewhere, an unseen hand was tightening a cord. Inside Delhi, that hand looked like ledgers and locks. Khilji's council heard the shouting. Merchants howling at price controls, nobles scoffing at lists and inspections, and the Sultan answered with arithmetic. 70,000 professionals and 700 elephants would meet the horde when the time and terrain favored the slow crush, not the quick kill. Until then, Delhi would weaponize the one thing the Mongols needed but could not steal. Predictable supply. So the stakes were nailed in place. Qutlugh Khwaja brought a raid sharpened into a legend. Delhi brought resolve, sharpened into a system. The storm approached. The plains held their breath, and behind the quiet, an economy began to march. The wall Delhi built had no stones. It began with subtraction. Before Mongol hooves blackened the horizon, Khilji stewards moved like frost through the countryside. Villages near the invasion corridors were emptied by order, not panic. People escorted inland with their tools and seed, herds driven to prearranged pastures, granaries sealed and mapped on government tablets no scout would ever find. Where the horde expected the usual harvest of war, fodder under eaves, grain in pits, poultry in yards, they found nothing but door frames and dust. A kingdom that looked deserted from the saddle was in fact folded inward, hidden behind ledgers. The policy had three teeth. First, evacuation and concealment. grain was not simply carted away. It was redistributed into layered stores, public depots in fortified towns, emergency caches along interior roads, and ghost granaries buried under stamped clay, recorded only in cipher on a scribe's wax board. Wells along likely raiding paths were capped or trapped. Those on interior lines were cleaned, lined, and guarded. Orchards were stripped early. Millstones were dismantled and hauled. The land did not burn. It went dim. Second, routes were carved and routes were killed. Foraging corridors that a horse army might try to ride were allowed to remain open, but only as channels watched by lookouts and measured for response time. Side tracks were blocked with felled timber and ditches. Bridges were weakened to fail under weight. Patrols did not contest ground they did not need. They blinked in and out, raising dust, loosing a flight of arrows, then fading to reveal nothing behind them. To the raider's eye, Delhi's frontier behaved like a mirage, always promising a granary just beyond the next bend, and always delivering empty air. Third, markets were turned from engines of profit into organs of war. Price controls froze the cost of staple grain and fodder for the army. Auditors prowled the bazaars with tablet and seal. Hoarders found their locks replaced with the sultan's. Caravans moved by schedule, not whim, and every sack on every cart existed on a list that matched a soldier's ration. The same arithmetic that denied the invader a meal guaranteed the defender a second week in the line. The result was a paradox cruel enough to matter. Delhi grew heavier and steadier as the Mongols grew lighter and slower. A horse archer empire is nothing without calories. Oats for the mount, fat for the rider, fire for the glue that binds sinew to horn. One empty village is an annoyance. A belt of emptiness 2 days deep is strategy. Speed, the horde's doctrine, required fuel at every halt. Khalji's wall of absence denied it, so the plains themselves began to resist. Scouts returned with ribs showing. Commanders widened their screens and found only wind. And somewhere behind that wind, a ledger balanced. Fodder tallied to elephants, grain to infantry, water to the next post, so that when the storm finally struck something solid, it would be a wall the earth had agreed to hold. The insult cut deeper than any raid. Delhi would not let money misbehave. Alauddin's first decree did not rattle a sword. It fixed a number. Wheat at this price, barley at that, fodder at less, frozen across the capital and radiating out through the market towns like rings from a hammer blow. Merchants cursed, then counted. Hoarders tested their locks, then found the Sultan's seal sitting on top of them. Prices no longer floated on rumor or famine. They marched in step with the army's needs. Call it market tyranny if you like. On campaign, it read as bread that always arrived. He built the machine to enforce it. A market ministry tallied stockpiles and posted ceilings. Inspectors walked with tablets, scales, and authority. Market police shadowed caravans, checked weights, broke monopolies, and made examples. Grain depots multiplied, public barns in stone, emergency pits under stamped earth, each entry mirrored in ledgers that matched rations to regiments. The arithmetic was brutal and elegant. If an elephant ate this much green fodder per day, and a battalion this much grain, then the road must carry precisely that weight on precisely those days. Cheats were not immoral. They were treasonous to the schedule. The same discipline bit the army. No more ghost troopers swelling a payroll. No more horses swapped after inspection. Cavalry mounts were branded and logged. Soldiers were described on rolls, name, mark, kit, so that the Sultan paid men he could point to, riding animals he had actually seen. Cash salaries were audited, arrears punished, double dips cut off at the wrist of paperwork. Muster became mathematics. The commander presented figures. The figures met the rolls. The rolls met the depot accounts. If numbers didn't kiss cleanly, somebody answered for the gap. What did that buy on the field? Time, which buys everything else. Fixed prices in Delhi meant rations didn't explode when rumors did. Honest weights meant a cart carried what its receipt claimed. A branded herd meant remounts were ready when bows frayed and flanks had to pivot. The invisible river of grain and fodder that keeps an army alive stopped meandering. It ran in banks of stone and ink. Even punishment served logistics. A speculator whipped in the square kept a wagon from vanishing on a back road 2 weeks later. Critics called it strangulation of the bazaar, a sultan's fist around every throat. But the point of the fist was circulation, forcing food and pay to pulse where the war demanded. The Mongols lived on chance, forage found, markets panicked, prices spiking behind their dust. Delhi bet on certainty, every grain made to march, every coin told where to sleep. When the horde looked for weakness in the usual places, greed, delay, confusion, it found clerks. And the clerks were armed with numbers that did not break under hunger or fear. They didn't dress a mob, they assembled a machine. 70,000 men stood on a payroll that actually paid, sorted by function instead of vanity. Heavy infantry with tall shields and spears for holding ground. Archers drilled to volley by signal drum, not by panic. Cavalry files whose mounts were branded, rationed, and rotated on schedule. Engineers with wagons of stakes, picks, and pre-cut fascines to turn open country into controlled lanes. Officers were promoted for counting as much as for killing. Muster was a spreadsheet before there were spreadsheets. Names, marks, kit, horse, pay. No ghosts, no guesses. The result was an army that could be pointed like a tool, not wished into courage like a crowd. And then came the 700. Each elephant was a fortress with a pulse. Leather-hardened capes or quilted armor hung over ribs and flanks. Laminar plates guarded the brow. Some tusks wore iron blades that turned a shove into a shearing stroke. On the back, a low tower, howdah, held 2 to 4 men. An archer with heavy short arrows meant to punch through rawhide. A javelin man for anything reckless at close range. Sometimes a shield man to guard the crew from return fire. None of it worked without the mahout, a specialist strapped behind the ears with an ankus, iron goad, and a bag of signals, voice, heel, touch, who could make 5 tons pivot in a corridor no horse would dare. Delhi's line did not simply use elephants, it architected them. Files were spaced so towers overlapped fields of fire. Intervals were measured to admit countercharges and release reserves. When the order was wall, handlers brought the beasts shoulder to shoulder, foreheads down, tusks angled. When the order was press, they advanced in a stagger that turned gaps into traps. Behind them, infantry stepped in lockstep to plug any recoil. Pavises up, spearheads slotted between legs in practiced choreography. The animal corps and the foot regiments rehearsed together until fear turned to muscle memory. Shock is physics, terror is chemistry. Step horses make their living on nerve and speed. They had neither in the shadow of a moving cliff. Trumpets and drums mattered, but the first defeat arrived by nose. The hot, bitter smell of elephant that domestic mounts are born to distrust. The second came by eye, a living wall that arrows annoyed but did not stop, advancing with a patience that couldn't be flanked inside its own geometry. Mongol doctrine teaches the wheel, the feint, the caracole. Those maneuvers want space. The elephant line ate space. Try to swarm a flank, and you found infantry wings curving out like lids. Ride in close to snipe a handler, and a tusk turned you sideways before your string came to the cheek. Could an elephant panic? Yes, Delhi trained for that too. Handlers carried cords to hobble a leg in extremis. Reserve crews practiced replacing a fallen mahout from the tower. Then rear ranks were drilled to open, absorb, and reform if a beast back. Discipline turned the corps from rumor into regimen. 70,000 professionals gave Delhi a spine. 700 colossi gave it a face the steppe could not forget, and a heartbeat the steppe could not outrun. He streaked ahead of the plan like a spark across dry grass. Safar Khan had the resume every drumbeat adores: victories against raiders, a taste for shock, a contempt for clocks. To him, war was a sprint with a sword in its teeth. To Alauddin, this campaign was an hourglass, pressure measured in days, not charges. The order from Delhi's nerve center was unambiguous: hold the line, keep the wall breathing, let hunger do what heroics cannot. Zafar heard it, saluted it, and then treated it as a suggestion. At Kili's open plain, the wind's own parade ground, he saw the Mongol van like a dare scribbled on the horizon. He asked for permission with his spurs. His division slid forward in a razor arc. Cavalry unlatched from the main body, kettle drums talking speed into the horses, standards bobbing like sparks. He aimed to punch, not pry, a fast break to shock the skirmish screen, then roll the flank before the elephant wall had even settled its feet. The move would be glorious if the enemy were slower, hungrier, or surprised. Qutlugh Khwaja smiled without moving his mouth. He had seen this posture on 3 continents. The commander who believes that a hard hit makes time itself flinch. Mongol scouts peeled back. Wings widened. The classic bowl took shape with professional boredom. Arrows arrived not in anger, but in arithmetic. First to slow, then to soften, then to herd. Zafar's point bit deep for one bright minute, then the ground tilted. When he sought space to wheel, the space was gone. His men met their own dust coming back. Encirclement is not a line, it's a decision. The ring closed where the terrain said it would. Horsebows spoke from every clock face, and the comet discovered what happens when speed loses a sky. Files crumpled, then clotted. Officers died trying to draw new geometry on air. Zafar fought like the story he wanted told. Close, loud, unafraid. It changed nothing. Arrows emptied saddles. Lances finished what hunger had begun. The drums that had promised momentum learned to beat for retreat, and could not. News travels faster than horses when it is shaped like a lesson. The shock in Delhi's ranks was real. A hero down, a wing torn, a day endangered. But inside the headquarters tent, a different calculation resolved. The worst internal risk to a slow-pressure doctrine is the brilliant exception who insists the clock is optional. With Zafar's fall, that risk vanished. There would be no more unauthorized crescents, no more sprints into bowls. The wall would breathe as designed. The army absorbed the loss with the same discipline it used to absorb a panicked elephant. Ranks opened, closed, and reset by signal. Reserves stepped into the bitten place. Standard bearers re-anchored the line to the elephant intervals. Qutlugh Khwaja had won a duel and lost a timetable. Delhi had lost a comet and gained the night. From that hour, the campaign spoke in Alauddin's grammar alone. Ration books, measured advances, patient pressure. The Mongols had executed a masterpiece of entrapment. The Sultan had executed a purge of haste. They arrived expecting a chase and found a chessboard. Kili's plain should have been a highway for the horse archer's gospel. Space to widen, wind to ride, horizons to bite. Alauddin turned that openness into a diagram. At the center, 700 elephants stood not as a line, but as a tessellation. Intervals set by pace length. Towers offset like teeth. Armor stitched in overlapping plates of boiled hide. Between each colossus, lanes for relief teams and water carts. Behind each, a pocket where archers and spearmen could step, shoot, and seal. This was not a front. It was a pressure surface. The tempo came measured, almost insolent. No trumpet for the gallop, only drum beats at marching cadence. Forward 6, halt 2, breathe the dust, trade arrows. The Mongols' advantage is rhythm, accelerate, scatter, sting, reform. Alauddin answered with meter, advance, absorb, answer, reset. When the first black sleet of arrows hissed over the plain, it struck hide and wicker screens, irritated more than penetrated. From the howdahs, short, heavy shafts returned, not for horses' chests, too well drilled to waste, but for eyes and wrists, the tiny places where a steppe army feels mortal. Flanks, the map said, endless. The formation said, no. Infantry wings stretched in elastic arcs from the elephant grid. Shields nested, pikes canted, javelins stacked. They did not promise to outrun a rider. They promised to be wherever he tried to pass. When a Mongol wing sought air to curl around the edge bent outward like a bow, presenting new ranks and fresh points. When the enemy feinted inward to force compression, the arcs drew back a spear's length and breathed, then reclosed on cue. Signals, flag, gong, whistle, moved along rehearsed paths, so the entire host behaved like a hinge cut from a single plank. The board had logistics built into its squares. Every third interval in the elephant line doubled as a resupply gate. Every fifth file in the infantry carried spare bowstrings and water skins instead of extra javelins. Runners, barefoot, numbered, drilled, cycled to and from dump points, scribed on the ground with lime. Mongol speed feeds on chaos in the enemy's rear. Kili's rear was a workshop. No cart wandered, no gap gaped. Psychology did as much smothering as geometry. Horses that would brave a storm balked at a moving wall that smelled of heat and sap and panic memories. Trumpets from howdahs broke arrow rhythm. Shadows from towers fell long across the dust, spoiling the eye for distances. Riders who looked for the familiar picture, the soft corner, the late opening seam, found instead a quilt that flexed wherever they pressed, never tearing, always thickening. Qutlugh Khwaja tried to write his favorite sentence, flank, fold, flood. The field answered in another language, center, hinge, seal. Each probe traded arrows for exhaustion. Each rally returned to find the grid exactly where it had been, only closer. By mid-afternoon, the steppe tempo was breathing through Delhi's lungs. Kili had no flanks because Alauddin refused to draw them. He offered surface, not edge, depth, not chase. Speed hit a net with no mesh size large enough to slip, and every heartbeat in that net was paid for ahead of time. Hunger has no banners, but it wins campaigns. By the third day on the Kili plain, Qutlugh Khwaja's army was still dangerous, still defiant, and already losing to math. A steppe horse is a miracle of efficiency, but even miracles eat 10-12 kilos of forage and buckets of water per mount per day. Alauddin had stripped the approaches bare, villages evacuated, granaries emptied, fodder caches lifted or burned, wells capped, fords picketed. The horde arrived as it always did, fast, light, living off the land, and found the land had been turned into glass. Horses that should have thundered began to whisper. Ribs showed. Sweat soured. The arrow's first ally, momentum, bled out of the herd. Arms tire next. Composite bows sing best on full stomachs and dry strings. Delhi's air carried night damp. Sinew backings drank it in. Bull-belly glue grew fickle. Strings stretched and frayed. A tired archer can keep cadence or keep accuracy, not both. Firing arcs rose too high, then too low, plucking at elephants' hides without puncturing the will behind them. Every missed salvo was paid for twice, once in wasted effort, once in the reply. Heavy, short arrows from howdahs that sought the soft human parts. Endurance cannot harden. Time pressed from all directions. Daylight rationed itself to the side with logistics. Alauddin's grid advanced in pulses that matched its supply rhythm. Water up, breath, Push. Oil rags for trunks and leather. Push. Slingstones for the light troops. Push. When Delhi halted, it was because the ledger said, halt. When it moved, the ledger said, now. Behind the board with no flanks was a tail with no chaos. Pack elephants queued at numbered posts. Runners swapping empty skins for full. Smiths replacing bent heads and nicked edges. Farriers tending the big feet that made the wall walk. No heroism required, only habit. Reputation tried to intervene. Men who had ridden down Russes and Persia reminded each other that fear feeds speed, but hunger eats reputation for breakfast. Horses balked at the smell and quake of the elephant mass. Riders compensated by widening, which lengthened rides between bursts, which burned more muscle on less hay, which deepened the bulk. It is a loop. Fatigue dulls judgment. Dull judgment wastes movement. Wasted movement deepens fatigue. The horde's proud dust plume thinned to a smudge. Even courage corroded. Mongol command could still order the textbook, test the seam, feint the center, fold a wing. The replies came with metronomic indifference, hinge, brace, seal, and every seal landed on a cavalry whose bowstrings had lost their bite and whose mounts no longer snapped to the spur. The best officers began to time their signals to the elephants' breaths, because Delhi's tempo, not theirs, ruled the field. Kili made an old truth visible. War is a contest of systems pretending to be a contest of men. Hunger was Alauddin's blade. Time was his anvil. Between them, they hammered the invincible into the ordinary, and the ordinary breaks. They looked immovable until they moved. All afternoon, the living wall had advanced in measured breaths. Push, dress ranks, water, push, teasing Mongol nerves without yielding a seam. Then with the sun an arm's length above the horizon, the wall stopped. Not a falter, an order. The front rank of elephants planted, trunks curled, tusk caps glinting. Behind them, shielded infantry settled, shields slightly canted to drink arrows. Standard bearers lowered pennons in unison. Across the plain, Qutlugh Khwaja felt the insult. A fortress parked in the open, inviting him to prove his legend. He signaled what Mongol doctrine always signaled when pride and opportunity aligned. A massed ride aimed to crack center and slosh around the pieces. Drums beat a gallop cadence. The black fan of horse archers thickened, then converged. Bows lifted for a storm salvo before the final rush. Dust lifted in a low curtain. Men shouted the old names to stiffen their spines. Jebe, Subutai, the river crossings at full flood. The horizon seemed to tilt toward victory. On Delhi's side, nothing shouted. A hand went up. Gongs thudded once along the line. Mahouts leaned into necks with hooked goads. The wall inhaled, one collective, terrifying breath, and became an avalanche. 700 colossi stepped, then surged, then charged in a taut, staggered ripple that kept intervals even as speed climbed. The ground transmitted it before the eye could. A bass thrum through soil, up fetlock into rider gut. Horses, bred to fear nothing but the void, felt an older terror and stuttered. The archer's storm salvo loosed ragged, high. Half the shafts slapped leather and fell uselessly among feet the size of shields. Impact was not a collision, but a conversion. Momentum changed ownership. Tusk caps caught girths and bellies. Trunks swept like flails. Forefeet hammered the churned dust into traps. Where one elephant struck, two more shouldered through the fragmenting wave, and behind them files of spearmen walked into the wake as if stepping down a staircase. The Mongol mass, engineered for flow, metageometry designed to shatter flow into panic. Gaps opened in the ride like cracks in lake ice. Units that would normally pour through seams found those seams occupied by more bulk, more tusk, more iron-tipped silence. Qutlugh Khwaja blew rally on his horn until his lips bled. Standards wheeled to signal a rightward peel, buying distance for bow work, but the peel needed space and breath. Hunger had already stolen both. The famed rolling fire degenerated into clutch shots as horses cringed from the smell, the heat, the scream. A few brave knots tried the classic fix: shoot the mahout, blind the beast. But Howdah archers hunted those angles, and Delhi's light troops stitched any opening with javelins. Then came the temptation that ruins victors, pursuit. A Mongol flank buckled. Riders streamed away in clumps. The field offered throats to chase. Alauddin's line did not bite. Another gong rolled along the ranks. Mahouts hauled their teams from gallop to grind. Infantry halted on a chalked mark as if a rope had snapped taut at their waists. No hero broke formation to collect ahead. The avalanche froze and reformed into wall. That discipline, more than tusk or terror, finished the set piece. The horde was broken, but not swallowed. Delhi would not trade a clean kill for a greedy rout. The message was precise as a ledger entry. We choose when we move, and we choose when we stop. They did not run so much as leak. What began as appeal to regroup became a thinning shadow across the plain. Knots of riders seeking air, edges fraying first, then centers, then command. Qutlugh Khwaja tried to knit it with horn calls and rotating standards. The old choreography that turned panic back into wheel and shoot. But Kili had been arranged against choreography. Every lane that looked open closed a rider's length later. An infantry file stepping 2 paces. An elephant pivoting like a gate. A shallow trench invisible until a horse collapsed into it. Retreat is an art when there are exits. Here, exits were a rumor. Delhi did not chase in a straight line. It bled the distance. Light archers in screened pairs loped along the Mongol flanks and rear, never committing, never closing the gap that would tempt a counter ride. They shot for horses first. Low, ugly angles under the belly, past the girth, at the eye, turning speed into stumble and stumble into heap. When a knot slowed to loose the practiced carousel of arrows, javelins arrived from directions the carousel could not face all at once. A drum beat would roll from Alauddin's center, and as if hauled by an invisible tether, the harassers fell back behind the elephant skirts to drink, restring, count, and go again. Pressure without risk, pain without purchase. Hunger did the work of a second army. Bowstrings, frayed by days of damp and dust, snapped at the worst moments. Men scavenged the dead for spares. Some rode with a single arrow left and shame burning hotter than the sun. Horses, those miracle engines of steppe war, showed hip bone and foam, ears glued flat at the smell of the great beasts pacing them like moving cliffs. The famed Mongol drill that made disorder temporary now met a fatigue that made disorder permanent. Commands moved slower than fear. Qutlugh Khwaja clawed for the river line, hoping current and bank would break the Indian cadence. But the fords were eyes that Alauddin had opened days ago. Scouts flagged, towers blinked, and the empty villages on the approach proved to be granary hollows for Delhi and mirage for the horde. Night did not bring cover. Night brought signal fires, and with the fires came arrows that arrived by sound before sight. No banner fell on Kili with theatrical finality. What fell was a reputation. Caravaneers on the Grand Trunk Road would later speak of it without poetry. The first time they saw Mongols ride with heads low and reins slack, not because an enemy pressed their backs, but because the road itself had turned against them. In frontier camps, boys who grew up on tales of unbroken conquest learned a new word to whisper with the old names. Kili, where the wind that always favored the steppe shifted in public, and the world saw that the horde could be unmade by arithmetic. Delhi did not celebrate. Delhi counted. Units halted on marks. Elephants watered by schedule. Patrols rotated like gears. The last arrows flicked at the last silhouettes until even the dust lost the energy to rise. When the field finally stilled, the silence had a shape. not triumphal, administrative. A ledger closed on a page that recorded something empires seldom admit. Legend has a bleed rate, and tonight it was measurable. Delhi did not crown itself in laurel. It put on a ledger. The morning after Kili, Alauddin's victory ritual wasn't a parade. It was an audit. Muster rolls were reread aloud, not by courtiers, but by clerks with ink-stained fingers. Names were matched to faces, faces to equipment, equipment to pay. Ghost soldiers, those convenient fictions that had fattened officers for years, were hunted out of the lists. 2 signatures or none. Wages moved only when the records agreed. The army's spine stiffened by design. Officers rotated off familiar posts before friendships could ripen into conspiracies. Garrisons swapped districts on a calendar that ignored personal comfort. Horses were inspected under a harsher light. Notched teeth, branded flanks, recorded ages. A mount that looked younger on paper than in the trace meant punishment. The chehra, descriptive role, bound the man. The dah, brand, bound the animal. No paper horse, no paper rider. Roads became organs of the state. Watchtowers sprouted along the arteries north and west. Beacons linked them at night, so alarm could travel faster than hooves. Way stations were assigned fixed stores of grain, water, and arrow shafts, each entry against a monthly tally. Patrols learned a new pace, neither heroic nor slack, just enough to make a raider feel seen. At the chokies, checkposts, weights were tested, seals examined, destinations written before the cart wheels turned. The frontier was no longer a line, it was a sieve. Supply left improvisation behind. The empire built 2 faces of abundance. Public granaries near markets, big, reassuring, loudly inventoried, and hidden depots in scrubland and stone, mapped only to a handful of keys. If a banner failed, a district would not. Carpenters roofed barns, masons lined pits, scribes marked levels against flood and drought. Grain was moved the way battalions move, on order, on time. In the bazaars, price was conscripted. The Diwan of markets posted ceilings on wheat, rice, ghee, cloth, iron. Inspectors walked with tablets and scales. Fines were immediate, exile or worse for the foolish. Hoarding was treated as treason by other means. Traders grumbled, then adapted. Predictable bread made for predictable ranks. Predictable ranks made for quiet borders. Money, too, learned a drill. Regular paydays at fixed sites under double count. With sudden, black audits to keep honesty from becoming optional. Readiness stopped being a campaign and became a climate. Elephants rotated through rest, drill, and repair. Mahouts logged wounds as carefully as armorers logged rivets. Infantry rehearsed on chalked fields that mirrored Kili's geometry. Elephant center, folding wings, step ladders of advance and refusal, until muscle memory could answer panic. Cavalry practiced against rules, not legends. No pursuit without signal, no heroics past the marker ropes. None of it glittered, all of it bit. Kili had proved a system could break a reputation. The weeks after proved a system could be made permanent. Where other realms waited for the next raid, Delhi waited for nothing. It watched, counted, rotated, paid, and in doing so, turned victory into routine. Victory made Delhi safer. It also made the court dangerous. The same ledgers that starved a horde also starved old privileges, and the men who had lived by soft numbers felt the bite. Great houses that once skimmed pay from phantom troopers found their stipends cross-checked by 2 clerks who did not bow low enough. Merchants who had salted away grain to sell at famine prices now faced fines with teeth. Temple treasuries and aristocratic estates, long treated as private ponds in a thirsty land, were asked to show their books. The whispers began as etiquette and ended as treason. Alauddin answered with administrative iron wrapped in silk. He did not thunder in the audience hall. He rearranged the furniture of power. Officer rotation accelerated so that provincial commanders never slept twice in the same web of favors. Tax farmers were replaced by salaried collectors whose careers could be ended by a column of figures. The buried intelligence drew breath again. Postmasters doubled as eyes. Market inspectors wrote more than prices. Palace stewards listened while pouring wine. A courtier who complained that the army's register humiliated gentlemen found his nephew audited, his stables counted, his bravery questioned by math. The conspiracies were elegant on paper. Restore custom, loosen prices, slow the drills, promise the cavalry a freer hand in pursuit. Their meetings were inelegant in practice, candles guttering, servants too close to the door, a cousin who owed the state more than he owed blood. When the Sultan moved, it was scalpel, not scythe. Arrests struck at hinge points. The paymaster who could open treasury locks. The gate captain who controlled the night keys. The noble whose town house sat astride the road to the citadel. Process, not spectacle, finished the rest. Charges read, confiscations logged, replacements sworn by the same oaths that bound cavalry and clerks. Doctrine crystallized out of the chill. The court heard it first as policy and later as catechism. National defense requires administrative discipline, not courage alone, not elephants alone, not a single brilliant charge, but a system that refuses leakage. Every exemption punched into the market ceiling is an arrow through an infantryman's ration. Every ghost in a muster roll is a hole in a line. Every lord who treats the frontier as rumor is a breach as real as an unguarded pass. Kili had proved that time and hunger can be forged into weapons. The palace would learn that corruption is an enemy with better scouts than any raider. There were costs. Old allies cooled. Poets found new metaphors for severity. The city learned to live with inspections the way a soldier learns to live with callous. But the armies were paid on the day. Grain prices held in drought, and the northern watchfires never went dark for want of oil. Nobles who wished for softer governance learned the new vernacular of loyalty. To keep privilege, keep the machine intact. The realm would not trade its survival for anyone's comfort, least of all the comfort of those who dined within the walls. Qutlugh Khwaja reached the step with dust instead of thunder, bringing back an education more painful than wounds. He had not been beaten by a better arrow or a faster horse. He had been unmade by a structure, by an enemy that weaponized absence, by roads that yielded nothing, by animals that turned speed into panic, by an army paid on the day and fed on schedule. Before the Khan, Khwaja described Delhi not as a city, but as a machine. Markets that moved like gears, ledgers that cut like blades, elephants that arrived like slow avalanches and did not tire. The court bristled. Pride demanded a duel of valor, not an audit of procedures. Yet the veterans, lean-faced and quiet, recognized a new grammar of war and did not interrupt. The reckoning was severe, but sober. Heads did not fall for drama. Notebooks opened for study. Scouts were ordered to map fodder belts, not just ford depths. Quartermasters were told to count grazing days the way archers count shafts. Young officers learned a phrase that tasted like stone. Supply is speed. The Khan's council spoke of countermeasures, advance magazines, longer leashes for baggage, forced requisition on a schedule, mounted cutters to blind elephants, smoke and fire to turn towers into cages. Even so, a truth had slipped like ice under every plan. An army that lives by the land can be starved by a land that refuses to live. Delhi's message to history was plainer still. Administration can be strategy. Scarcity can be directed. Terror can be slowed to a human pace and then suffocated. The secret weapon at Kili was not a miracle alloy. It was lists that closed, prices that did not float. Soldiers who existed in the ledger as surely as in the ranks, roads that carried grain as faithfully as orders carried obedience. The Elephant Corps made the lesson visible. 700 moving arguments against cavalry psychology. But the decisive blow fell earlier, on empty threshing floors and sealed granaries. Reputation met rationing and discovered that legend cannot eat. For the steppe, this demanded humility, the realization that invincibility is a logistics story told too long without revision. For historians, it demands breadth, to read campaigns as systems, inputs, throughputs, outputs, not just as tableau of courage. Kili sits with the rare battles, Marathon's discipline, Liangtang's powder, Trafalgar's signal book, where the winner changed the rules rather than the angles. Alauddin's India proved that a sovereign can mint endurance the way he mints coin, and that a state can turn markets into armor without forging a single new blade. No lesson is permanent, only the habit of learning is. The steppes would ride again, and Delhi would face storms it had not modeled. But after Kili, the world had a new template for resisting machines of conquest. Starve their speed, price their legend, and meet their charge with creatures older than fear, and a bureaucracy colder than steel.